This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour and welcome to Unique Scotland, the go-to podcast on all things Scottish, and I'm delighted to have you with me on this first part of a tour around Scotland's largest city, Glasgow. It may be the largest, but it's not the capital, and I'm going to take you back to where it all started, and I think you'll be surprised as to how young, relatively speaking that is, the city of Glasgow actually is. And I'm going to let you in on the secret of the ancient symbols that represent Glasgow and are displayed all over the city. And once I've pointed them out, you'll be surprised how often you come across them on your visit to the city. So you're going to join me on a panoramic tour of Glasgow, and it's interesting to see the diverse age and architecture of this fine, semi-medieval, modern city. Well, as I broadcast, it's now the beginning of February, and the weather can't make up its mind. Yesterday, -3 degrees centigrade. Today, +8. But I'm pleased to say there's not been too much snow in the lowlands, although I can see the local mountains are covered. Hopefully you'll have listened to my last podcast, which was a letter from Scotland with a roundup on 2024. It was entitled Shipwrecks, Shenanigans and Sheepdogs, and if that title intrigues you and you haven't listened, then put it on your list of things to do. Today I'm recording this Glasgow episode 1 from a lovely hotel in the south of England of all places, as I take my first break of 2025 before the beginning of the touring season. I've actually come down to Portsmouth to visit the place where I joined the Royal Navy, having run off to sea at the age of 16. Perhaps more of that story in another podcast. Actually, my touring season may start a little later, as I intend going to New York in early April for the annual Tartan Parade. It's my first visit to New York, and I have to admit to being a wee bit excited. So this is the first episode of my series on Glasgow City, and in the first couple of episodes I'm going to take you with me through the city streets, pointing out the main buildings and giving you background and context of what we see, including wonderful architecture and extraordinary sculptures that adorn the city. Subsequent podcasts will go into more detail on the medieval side of Glasgow, including the Cathedral, and I'll also be covering the more modern side, including some of the galleries, especially the fabulous Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. And my intention is to finish with a story of shipbuilding on the Clyde, that famous river that runs through the centre of Glasgow. So let's get started, and we'll commence this panoramic tour of Glasgow covering the central area. In this episode, we'll be driving from the modern centre of the city, George Square, out to the medieval cathedral and down the old High Street and onto Glasgow Green and the People's Palace. Most of Glasgow dates from the 19th century onwards, and even some of these amazing 19th century facades are fronting what is an extremely modern building behind. Some of the extraordinarily huge mansions which have been converted to galleries or banks were built by very rich men in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So where did that wealth come from? And why was Glasgow given the prestigious title of Second City of the Empire? Well, let's find out. And to see some great photos of Glasgow, have a look at my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or on my Facebook page. Indeed, there are a few reels on Glasgow on Instagram, and you can find that at exclusive_Scottish_visits. And one of my Instagram and Facebook reels is showing Glasgow University with almost 20,000 views, so do have a look. Well, it's time to get this tour started. And wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax and to join me on this first episode of Glasgow City, a panoramic tour. As it happens, I'm an East Coastie, or someone that comes from the east coast of Scotland. And to make that clear to my non-UK listeners, that means I'm from Edinburgh, so some would say that I'm the last person who should be telling you about Glasgow on the west coast of Scotland. And I do recall as a young man from Edinburgh not wishing to visit Glasgow, which we considered to be a bit rough and unwelcoming. Well, I'm pleased to say that opinion has completely changed, and although I do find it difficult sometimes to drive around the one-way system, Glasgow has grown on me greatly, and I do enjoy taking guests to visit. Anyway, let me begin this Glasgow tour where Glasgow really started, in the 6th century, when a Christian missionary, Saint Kentigern, or Saint Mungo as he's known locally, established a church on the Mollendinner Burn, or Small River, and that church grew over many years into the present-day Glasgow Cathedral. Now, we know there were small communities around the River Clyde for millennia, taking advantage of the natural food resources. We also know the Romans were here in the 1st to the 3rd centuries, building outposts to protect themselves from the Pictish hordes, and the Romans built a wall from the east to the west coasts, called the Antonine Wall, which was a turf fortification from the River Clyde to the River Forth by Edinburgh. But it was really Saint Kentigern who planted the seeds of a major community which would grow into the famous city we now see today. Saint Mungo's early church soon became a religious centre, and when he died, a shrine was built which was visited by thousands of pilgrims over the years. Now, there's little information regarding the early church buildings, but the present 12th century cathedral was built over his shrine, and that shrine is now incorporated into Glasgow's lower church. It's clear that St Mungo's resting place was a huge draw for Christians up until the Reformation in the 16th century. Now, before we start the tour of Glasgow, I want to give you some information on St Mungo's life to allow you to understand where the symbols of Glasgow come from. The most popular story of Mungo originates on the east coast of Scotland, in East Lothian, where I live, on top of the hill called Traprain Law. Now, I did mention this in passing in my podcast on East Lothian, episode 2, so have a listen if you've not caught that one yet. Anyway, Mungo's mother was Tinu, sometimes referred to as Enoch, the daughter of King Ludin or King Loth, and from Traprain Law he ruled the area which is now Lothian, or as we pronounce it, Lothian. There's a suggestion that Tinu, the princess, had an affair with a man named Owain Maborien and became pregnant. Her father was furious and she was thrown out of the community from the heights of Traprain Law. She survived the fall and escaped in a small boat, landing on the other side of the River Forth at a village called Curus, which even today is a beautiful village with original medieval buildings and cobbled streets. Tinu was taken in by Saint Cerf at the local monastery, where her son Mungo was born in 528 AD, and here he was brought up under the tutelage of Saint Cerf. After one of the old monks named Fergus died, Mungo was told in a dream to take his body in a bullock cart, and wherever it stopped he was to bury the body and build a church. He headed west, and not far from the shrine of St Ninian, the bullocks stopped and refused to go further. Mungo named the place Glasgow, or Glasgow, usually translated from Gaelic to Deer Green Place. He was given land to build his church by Rudderk, the king of Strathclyde, and the chosen site is the site of the present-day cathedral. Now, Mungo died around 605 AD, and to become a saint there were 4 miracles attributed to him, and this is where the symbols of Glasgow originate. And there's a small verse associated with the miracles to help you remember, and it goes like this: "Here's the bird that never flew, here is the tree that never grew, here's the bell that never rang, here is the fish that never swam." And these verses refer to events in Mungo's life. The bird that never flew refers to his time at the monastery in Curus, where a robin was killed by some of his classmates. It's understood that Mungo breathed onto the robin's beak and it came back to life. The tree that never grew refers once more to Saint Cerf's monastery, where Mungo had been left in charge of a fire, but he fell asleep and the fire went out. In the morning he took a hazel branch, blew onto the branch and restarted the fire. The bell that never rang refers to a bell that's thought to have been given to Mungo by the Pope when he was on a pilgrimage to Rome. And the fish that never swam is quite an interesting story, and it refers to Queen Langareth of Strathclyde, who was suspected of infidelity by her husband. King Rudderk secretly threw her wedding ring into the River Clyde, then demanded to see it on pain of death. Faced with the execution, the Queen asked Mungo for help. He ordered a messenger to catch a fish in the river, and on opening the fish, the ring was miraculously found inside, which allowed the Queen to clear her name. 4 miracles attributed to Mungo, raising him to sainthood. And on any tour that you might do in Glasgow, you will now see these symbols and understand where they came from. Indeed, the symbols are represented in the city's coat of arms. and Glasgow's current motto, Let Glasgow Flourish, are inspired by Mungo's original call, Let Glasgow Flourish, by the preaching of the word. And of Saint Mungo today, his remains lie within the lower church of Saint Mungo's Cathedral, and as Glasgow patron saint, he will certainly not be forgotten. It was from these early beginnings that Glasgow flourished, first with Saint Mungo's early churches, then the 12th century cathedral, to the founding of the University of Glasgow adjoining the cathedral in 1451, and Glasgow itself becoming a bishopric in 1492. This in turn increased the town's educational status and religious hierarchy, and the town was awarded city status. Wealth from trade poured into the city with brewing, and of course monks were well noted for this activity, to agriculture, fishing, with cured fish being exported to Europe and further afield. And by the late 1400s, Glasgow stretched from the area around the cathedral down to the river with a castle, medieval religious buildings, a toll booth, all the way down the high street to the River Clyde, where you find the Salt Market and Bridgegate, which refers to one of the first bridges to span the river. Early inhabitants would have numbered a few thousand, and the first census, around 1720, showed there were around 15,000 people, but by 1801 this had swelled to 70,000. Today, beginning of 2025, Glasgow's city population is 610,000, compared to Edinburgh, which is around 560,000. So you can see how it's grown, and the sprawl of Glasgow will become more evident as we tour the city. And talking of touring the city, you now know the origins of this fine deer green place, so let's get on the road and see the main thoroughfares and some of the main sites on a small tour. The first thing you'll notice when driving around Glasgow, and which is different from Edinburgh, is the city streets running north and south are on a considerable incline, to such an extent that Glasgow has occasionally been used as a film set location for San Francisco. Glasgow's hills were established around 10,000 years ago when the retreating and melting glaciers deposited huge amounts of earth and clay that they'd gathered when they'd first advanced over 20,000 years before. And these hills are called drumlins, and if you're able to see a photograph of Glasgow from above, before the city was built, you'd see a large number of circular mounds where these drumlins have come to rest. I'm going to start in the centre of the city, George Square, the principal civic square in Glasgow, named after King George III, who was on the throne from 1760 to 1820. You may have heard of him, as he was the king who lost us that colony across the other side of the Atlantic, and which today is known as the United States of America. There should have been a statue to George in the centre of the square, but the loss of this colony and all the trade that went with it meant that it never came to pass. And if you were standing in George Square in the early 1700s, then you would have been in the middle of marshland, in an area where they used to slaughter horses. It was around 1770 that Glasgow Corporation bought the land and developed it into an exquisite residential area with private gardens at the centre. The only buildings to survive from that period make up the Millennium Hotel. And if you look at the front of the hotel, you can imagine from the frontage beautiful mansion townhouses separately owned by rich individuals, and these residences, built in the late 1700s to early 1800s, would have lined the whole square. This set of buildings became the Queen's Hotel in 1855, just to service the newly opened Queen Street station, just to the left of the hotel as you look at it. As an aside, this hotel's where in 1941 Winston Churchill met President Roosevelt's special envoy Harry Hopkins to discuss the ability of the British to continue fighting the Nazis during the Second World War and the possibility of American assistance. Looking at some other buildings in the square, as you face the hotel, turn right 90 degrees and the fabulous Italian Renaissance building on that side of the square is the City Chambers, or in American parlance, the Mayor's Office. It was designed by William Young and built in 1888 and was opened by Queen Victoria. It incorporates an Italianate style with a vast array of ornate decoration with columns at every level. The huge pediment above the door was designed to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. It depicts Victoria enthroned, surrounded by emblematic figures of Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales, alongside the colonies of the British Empire. The interior is fabulous, as well with a magnificent marble staircase. It really is something to behold. It's said that it's got more marble than any other building in the world, except for the Vatican. And it is possible to do a tour of this fine building, so go to the website and book yourself on. And by the way, the entrance hall to the city chambers depicts the city's coat of arms, which reflect the legends of Saint Mungo, with the bird, the tree, the bell and the fish. After a while, you will notice them everywhere in Glasgow. From the city chambers, turn right 90 degrees again, and feast your eyes on the former General Post Office building, built in 1878 by Robert Matheson in an Italianate style. And note the beautiful polished red granite pillars at the door. That granite was actually quarried on the island of Mull, one of my favourite islands. Today the building's actually a shell, and the frontage is really all that remains. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a glass roof, and within, the original interior has been replaced with prestigious offices, apartments, and upmarket restaurants on the ground floor. Diagonally opposite this building is the Merchant's House, designed by John Burnet and built in about 1877, and you'll recognise it with the globe and sailing ship on top of the tower. The merchants were always a powerful body in the city, and it's said that they protected Glasgow Cathedral during the worst of the Reformation fervour for destroying Catholic buildings. This building is a beautiful example of opulence inside and out, befitting the power and wealth of the merchants. And if you forget what the building is, the Merchant's House, then above the doorway on George Square is a pediment with the letters MH. The wonderful dome tower at the top of the building is topped by a sailing ship on a globe, symbolising the worldwide trade in which the merchants were involved. Now, let's turn to the centre of the square and to some of the sculptures therein. And the first one I'd like to mention is the War Memorial, or Glasgow's cenotaph, from 1920, remembering Glaswegians lost in the First World War, or the Great War, or the war to end all wars, if only. Of course, it now represents all those who've died in subsequent wars. It was actually unveiled by General Haig, the First World War Supreme Commander, in 1924. There are a number of statues in George Square, and right in the centre is a tall 80-foot tower on top of which stands Sir Walter Scott, and it's believed it's one of the first to be built in his honour. There's 11 other statues around the square, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about them, but if you're visiting the city after March, April this year, then you won't see them, because starting shortly, all statues will be removed to a safe location for conservation, while a complete revamp of George Square is undertaken over the next 2 years, when they will be returned. So if you're listening to this after April 2027, and I hope many of you are, then expect to see the following. The first I'd like to mention are the only known equestrian statues of a young Queen Victoria beside her husband Prince Albert, 1866, both sculpted by Carlo Marachetti. Robert Burns, the Scottish bard, is there, Thomas Campbell, another Scottish poet, inventor James Watt, the chemist Thomas Graham, General Sir John Moore, and Field Marshal Lord Clyde, and there's a couple of politicians as well. So, sorry you will miss them this year and next, but they could do with a good clean and have some conservation work on them ready for 2027. Before we leave George Square, I just want to mention the area that we're about to pass through called Merchant City, which today is considered to be one of the most prestigious areas in Glasgow, although it had very austere beginnings, with warehouses and factories belonging to the rich cotton, tobacco and sugar barons dominating the landscape. Today it contains upmarket apartments, restaurants, bars and offices, many of which have been repurposed from the old city halls and old fruit market. I won't be going into detail in this podcast about this area, but it's most certainly an area to visit, even if it's just for a good meal in a good restaurant. I've eaten in some wonderful restaurants, such as Brewdog or Druthie's or the Italian Kitchen, and I thoroughly enjoyed a meal at the Santa Lucia Italian restaurant. This is being broadcast February 2025, so things may change if you're listening to this in a few years' time. To some extent, the Merchant City of Glasgow mirrors Covent Garden in the West End of London, a place I used to frequent when I lived there. An important part of the Merchant City's identity is the high-end shopping with the 1991 Italian Centre, an excellent example of classical buildings which include art in their architecture. You'll find it on Ingram Street, and as you face the building you will detect the Palazzo style with a beautiful sculpture of Italia by Alexander Stoddart on top. There's residential apartments, offices, cafes and high-end retail outlets, all grouped around a central courtyard. And you'll find all the famous brands, including Emporio Armani and Versace. Well, we're now going to leave the square, heading east towards the cathedral. And it's probably worth having a small map in front of you to view the different streets I'm going to talk about, maybe even Google Maps on your computer. Effectively, drive along George Street and turn left up Montrose Street until you come to Cathedral Street, then turn right. And hey presto, the Cathedral is straight ahead. You will see some grand new buildings either side along this road, and they mainly belong to Strathclyde University. At the end of Cathedral Street, you come to Castle Street, where you turn right. Straight ahead, you will see Glasgow Cathedral, or Saint Mungo's Cathedral, with its tall spire and green roof. Immediately to the left of the cathedral is the Royal Infirmary, or hospital, and as you turn right down Castle Street, you will see what looks like an old stone building on the left-hand side. This is Saint Mungo's Museum of Religious Life. There used to be a 13th century royal castle on this site, but it was dismantled in 1789 to make way for the Royal Infirmary. If you're standing at the side of the Museum of Religious Life in the square leading to the cathedral front door, you will see the outline of the castle on the ground, marked by old stone cobbles amongst the new paving. The castle played its part in the 13th century Wars of Independence, with William Wallace capturing it from the English in 1296. In later centuries, it was used as a bishop's palace until the late 17th century, when it was abandoned. It was also used for a while as a prison, including holding some Jacobites after the 1715 uprising, but was effectively derelict by 1727. So as you look at the cathedral, you have the Royal Infirmary to the left and the Museum of Religious Life to your right. The infirmary has been on this site since the late 18th century, and the original building was designed by the famous Adam family. The hospital today is a mix of 19th and 20th century buildings, with the opening of the latest Queen Elizabeth department by the late Queen in 1986. On the other side, the Museum of Religious Life looks similar in age to the surrounding medieval buildings, but was actually built in 1989 and opened 4 years later, and it really does blend in beautifully with the older buildings. The museum is extraordinary in that its exhibits relate to all the world's major religions, and at the back of the building is a Zen garden. And it's believed that this is the only public museum in the world devoted to religion. Turning to the 12th century cathedral, which houses the relics of Saint Kentigern, or Saint Mungo as he's known locally, is a masterpiece of medieval construction and has stood the test of time, even in the face of the Wars of Independence, the Reformation in the 1560s, and even the bombing of Glasgow in the Second World War. It's beautiful both inside and out, and I'm going to tell you all about that in a separate podcast, so watch out for that after I complete the Panoramic Tour podcasts. Well, as we head down Castle Street, look up to the left of the cathedral, and on the hill behind, to the right of the cathedral, is one of the city's necropolis, or necropoli, or centre for the dead, effectively a burial ground for the rich and famous of the 19th century, and more of that on my Cathedral podcast. Now, directly opposite the Museum of Religious Art is one of the oldest buildings in Glasgow, and that is Provand's Lordship, which was built in 1471 and was part of St Nicholas's Hospital nearby. It's believed that the house was part of the accommodation for 32 canons of the cathedral. Anyway, it's a super example of the time, and it's been beautifully refurbished inside and out, and is a real insight into the buildings of that period. Entry's free, and I can guarantee it's well worth a visit. Continuing down Castle Street, on the right-hand side, you will see a large, stunning Victorian neo-Gothic style church built in red sandstone. This is the Barony Hall, which used to be the Barony Church, and the church is now deconsecrated, and the building is used as a ceremonial hall for the University of Strathclyde, which they restored in 1989. Directly opposite the Barony Hall is a statue of a man on a horse. This is William of Orange, or King Billy, and he became King of Great Britain when James II was exiled to France in 1689 during the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution, which kick-started the James or Jacobus Rebellion, with the rebels becoming known as the Jacobites, or as we knew them, Jacobites. Of course, we know the Jacobite cause was crushed some 50 years later when Bonnie Prince Charlie's army was comprehensively beaten at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Another story for another day. Continuing down Castle Street, it becomes the High Street, as this was the main thoroughfare in medieval times, and you'll notice that any medieval buildings have gone and more modern structures are in their place. You may start to see murals on the gable ends of some of the buildings, and as I record this podcast, February 2025, there's a lovely large mural taking up a whole wall depicting a gentle bearded man looking kindly on a robin sitting on his index finger. is called the Saint Mungo mural and depicts one of Mungo's miracles in bringing the bird back to life, as I mentioned earlier. There are many more murals all over the city, and you can actually do a mural trail if that really interests you. Well, now continue all the way down the high street until you come to a very tall clock tower with a blue face on its clock. You've arrived at a major crossroads. This is Glasgow Cross, and the tower is the remains of an old Glasgow toll booth, a local government building constructed in 1634, which replaced a 14th century toll booth. The main offices were a 5-storey main block with a 7-storey tower at the end, but this block was demolished in 1921 when the Glasgow authorities met elsewhere. The tower remains, and it's a beautiful structure built in the Scottish baronial style with dressed ashlar sandstone. It was used as a council meeting place and a courtroom as well as a prison in the 17th and 18th centuries. 22 executions took place at this toll booth, and you can still see iron rings on the outer walls where prisoners were shackled. Sends a shiver up your spine. We turn left at this junction onto the road named Gallowgate, one of the oldest thoroughfares in Glasgow, and whose name is a reminder that the executioner's scaffold once stood near this point. Immediately on the right-hand side as we turn, there's an octagonal structure with a tall column in the centre with a statue of a unicorn on top. This is a replica of the original Market Cross, which was removed in about 1659. As mentioned in previous podcasts, the Market Cross marked the place in a town where markets were legally held. It was the town's symbolic centre, and all boroughs had one. It was not replaced until 1930 and now forms part of Glasgow's historical past, as the centre, of course, has now moved west to George Square. Drive along the Gallowgate and turn right at the lights into Moore Street, then next left onto London Road. As you drive along the road, look out on the left-hand side for Glickman's Sweetie Shop, which is the oldest confectionery shop in Glasgow, opened in about 1903 and still going strong. And when you walk in to this super wee sweetie shop, there's the lovely sweet aroma of sugar, caramel, lemon and many other tastes that we loved as children and still love today. The shelves are packed with boiled sweets or candy, as some may refer to them, of every kind. And it's a nostalgic visit for any adult who remembers the old style of sweetie that we used to buy with our pocket money. I always remember my favourite was a sherbet dip, effectively a packet of sherbet with a piece of licorice sticking out the top. You'd lick the licorice and then dip it into the sherbet for a sweet and licoricey type of taste. It was really yummy. Anyway, before I get carried away, we turn right into Greendyke Street, and as you turn, look off to your left and you might just catch sight of the Barras, or as it used to be known, the Barrowland Ballroom, which was built in the 1930s and hosted ballroom dancing. Many a young man met the love of his life in this place. Today you'll find modern stage performances, and I've just looked at what's on, and in the next month you can see Celtic Connection, The Jam, KT Tunstall and the Bluebells Group, and much more. So if you're in Glasgow, have a look at the Barrowlands website to see if anything takes your fancy. Within the same site as Barrowlands Ballroom is the Barras, which effectively is an outdoor market for all those bargains that you would like to buy. It's a bit rough and ready, but certainly fun to walk around. We'll now continue along Greendyke Street, and on the left-hand side you will see a large green space open up. This is called Glasgow Green, a public park. It was actually given to the Bishop of Glasgow by James II of Scotland in 1450 for public grazing, although the present layout dates from the 1820s. The public were given the right to hang out their washing on the green, and that right is still practised by some locals today. Well, we turn left into the green and drive up to the People's Palace at the end of the driveway. As you drive towards the People's Palace, on your right-hand side, you'll see a large obelisk in the centre. It's 144 feet high and was designed by the architect David Hamilton. This is a monument to Lord Nelson for his amazing victory at the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805 against the combined fleets of France and Spain. Now, Napoleon had hoped that his fleets would take control of the English Channel, but Nelson's great victory put paid to any invasion plans of Great Britain that Napoleon may have had. Now, as many of my listeners will know, I was a Royal Naval officer and joined the Navy at the training base in Portsmouth on the south coast of England. Well, that's exactly where I am today, and I've returned to Portsmouth for a visit to see old friends. I called into the historic dockyard to see Lord Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, which has been preserved from the time of the Battle of Trafalgar. It is amazing to see this extraordinary battleship of the early 19th century and imagine where Nelson would have stood to command the battle. However, before I digress further, we continue along the road, and at the end you will come to a roundabout with an amazing fountain. And to the right there's a beautiful red sandstone building with a huge dome and large glass houses at the rear. The building is the People's Palace. But before I talk about it, I want to tell you about the extraordinary fountain that's right in front of us. This is the Doulton Fountain, designed by Arthur Edward Pearce and was built to commemorate the 1887 Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria by the Royal Doulton Ceramics Company owned by Sir Henry Doulton. It is made from terracotta and at a height of 46 feet and a water basin spanning some 70 feet, it's believed to be the largest terracotta fountain in the world. Adorning the top of the fountain is Queen Victoria herself, dressed as the Empress of India and wearing the imperial crown. It really is a historical gem with fabulous sculptures and even depicts Britain's 4 colonies of Australia, Canada, India and South Africa. How time has passed. Just beyond the fountain and the People's Palace is an unusually ornate building which resembles the Doge Palace in Venice. This is the Templeton Business Centre, built in 1888 to design by the renowned architect William Leiper. It was actually a carpet factory belonging to the very successful James Templeman, but why the exquisitely ornate design? Well, Glasgow Green was quite an affluent area at the time, and local residents did not want a factory on their doorstep. There were already numerous weaving sheds around the park, and the NIMBY Brigade, or Not in My Backyard Brigade, did everything to block the build. To overcome the protests and win council building approval, James Templeton hired the services of the esteemed architect William Leiper, who was well known for his fabulous mansion houses, and commissioned him to come up with something that did not look anything like a factory. The Doge Palace lookalike won the day, and when you see it, you'll see an incredibly beautiful building. Certainly doesn't look like a carpet factory. I recall visiting Venice a few years ago, sitting in the square behind the Doge Palace, having a cool beer and marvelling at the real architectural beauty, when all of a sudden the water from the canal came streaming across the square and up to my ankles. Well, I can confirm that I did finish my beer before I left for higher ground. Coming back to Templeton's carpet factory and the lookalike Doge Palace, there was one tragic event during the build when a wall collapsed, crashing down on some of those weavers' huts that I've just mentioned, and sadly 29 female workers were killed, and some said that the building might be cursed. But it was completed, and some of the carpets that were produced would decorate exalted places such as Westminster for 2 British coronations, a carpet for the White House in Washington DC, and carpets for various luxury ocean liners. It continued to trade until 1980, when it closed down and is now the Templeton Business Centre. Turning now to the building I first mentioned, the People's Palace and Winter Garden, it's basically a local history museum and glasshouse at the rear with some tropical plants grown locally. It was opened in 1898 by the 5th Earl of Rosebery, who, on declaring it open, said it would be open to the people forever and ever. It took inspiration from another museum for the people in the East End of London, who also suffered severe hardship. Certainly in those days, the East End of Glasgow was overcrowded, poverty-stricken, and one of the most unhealthy parts of the city. The People's Palace was to provide a cultural centre for the ordinary people, becoming a museum of social history for the city of Glasgow, and telling the story of Glaswegians from the 1750s to the present. Well, now, until a couple of years ago, I could have told you what was inside, such as a replica of the inside of a one-room Glasgow tenement, or photographs of going to the local steamy, which was a communal laundry, or dancing at the Barrowland Ballroom. Unfortunately, the palace has had to close its doors for refurbishment and will not now open until 2027. So, before then, we can only guess at the displays and artefacts that will resurface when the refurbishment is complete. However, if you're travelling and you're listening to this in 2027, go and see it. It's excellent. Well, my avid listeners, that is the end of Glasgow Episode 1, and this is where the tour ends, in Glasgow Green. Next time, we will traverse the central area of Glasgow and follow a route that will bring us out to the west and the more affluent areas of the city, including Glasgow University and Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. Lots still to see and do, so can't wait to tell you all about it. As always, I thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you, and I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of the areas we've visited today, or if you wish me to cover any aspect of Scottish life, then please do get in touch through the contact page on my website or send an email to info@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm also delighted to have heard from many of you who have listened to the podcast, and it's always great to meet some of you personally. Keep your messages of support coming, and don't forget, if you do intend visiting Scotland without a formal guide, then perhaps one of my bespoke itineraries may help you plan a more spectacular holiday. Drop me a line, I'll be happy to help. If you do wish to use a driver guide, then please get in touch using my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, and use the contact page or email me direct using john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, and I'll respond to you immediately with availability. Even if I'm not free, I may be able to recommend a fellow qualified guide to look after you in Scotland. And thank you so much to those of you who have bought me a coffee. And if you wish to contribute in a small way to these podcasts, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. All contributions are much appreciated. Or just share these Unique Scotland podcasts with friends and family. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you all listening today, and please follow on your podcast platforms to get notification of future podcasts. You can also register on my website. Well, as always, it's been a blast, and I would now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising my glass with a wee dram to you wherever you are in the world. Slàinte.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.